Okay, I think we're on. So hi everyone, really excited to moderate this panel with a distinguished group of pioneers at the cutting edge of prevention and detection in oncology. As intro, I'm Vivian, I'm a partner at Payor VC, I lead our healthcare practice. Also host one of our podcasts called Payor Healthcare Playbook, where we talk about how to get from 0 to 1 with healthcare entrepreneurs and healthcare leaders. Really excited to also share that we've been early investors at the cutting edge of oncology as well, so really excited to be here. We were investors in Guardant Health, in Xylus, in Foresight Diagnostics, as well as Valor Labs, so excited to have the best of the best here. So I'll let everyone start with a quick intro, a little bit about themselves, their role, and a little bit about your company for those who are not familiar. Megan, you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Megan Hall, really excited to be here with this esteemed set of panelists. I am head of corporate affairs at Grail, actually started, and a distinguished scientist, but started out by building the medical affairs department at Grail 6 years ago when I started at the organization. Grail is a company whose mission is to detect cancer early when it can be cured. I think we are all passionate about that, I hope. And this is really a really critical mission because we only have screenings for 5 different cancers right now. And so we really need to expand the benefits of those single cancer screenings to as many cancer types as possible. And so we have a product on the market right now called Gallery that is a blood-based multi-cancer early detection test that does just that. So I'm sure we'll get into it in a little bit of more detail in a minute. So,
Andrew, you want to go next?
Hi, my name is Andrew. I'm CEO of Preventive. Healthcare is life, and our mission as a company really is to imagine what our lives might be like were we to be provided with precise, comprehensive, preventative insights and early diagnosis. And this is not just a pipe dream. In clinics across North America, with many more to come, we use proprietary MRI machines to do clinical diagnostic imaging of every organ of the body, cataloging everything that we find. These techniques, they're effective at identifying cancer at stage 1 and hundreds of other medical conditions. We work to improve lifespan by diagnosing cancer and disease early when treatment, obviously like everyone else around this round table, where treatment is easier, cheaper, and more likely to be successfully achieved. And then we work to improve health span by identifying the early beginnings of chronic disease, where oftentimes all you need to do is adjust lifestyle in order to ensure that that chronic disease never manifests. Taken together, we hope to improve health outcomes for everyone and reduce costs in the healthcare system.
Awesome. Everett? Or
Peter, go ahead.
Sure. Vivian, thanks. I'm Peter Bach. I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician. I'm the chief medical officer at Delphi Diagnostics. I came to it after about a 20-year academic career where I led a number of guideline and evidence review around cancer prevention and screening, including in lung cancer, and worked in the lung cancer space as well, developing clinical risk models. I was the Medicare requester for lung cancer screening coverage with low-dose CT. So it may not surprise you to hear that Delphi Diagnostics is developing a lung cancer screening test. And in fact, we launched it yesterday. And the way we think about this problem probably differs on some dimensions than some of the other folks here. I think we're all trying to do important things, but we view screening as a population problem and a population opportunity. And the only way to really drive health improvement at the population level is to have a test that successfully finds the earliest stages of cancer, which we call stage 1. At high rates. That's something we call sensitivity of a test. It means if the cancer's there, your test finds it. The next is to have a pricing structure that really allows you to disseminate the test to the population at need. And lung cancer is a disease that disproportionately affects people of less means. And so having a test that's a few $100s, which is what ours is something that can scale. And the last is, it's hard enough to get recommended screening to happen. In the US, only about 6% of people who should have lung cancer screening per guidelines and evidence do. And doing the hard work of even getting to that population, where more than 10,000 lives could be saved per year, is really our focus. And so through an efficiency-oriented stance, That's where we've gone, and it's because that's where the evidence is. If you do a test, you know what to do next. You don't create this challenge to the healthcare system, which you can barely handle.
Thanks, Vivian. My name is Everett Cunningham. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Exact Sciences. We are a company that is involved in preventing cancer, detecting it earlier, and then guiding therapy for the best therapies. Our claim to fame is we have Cologuard. Cologuard is a non-invasive at-home test for colorectal cancer screening. That test was launched about 10 years ago. And so far we screened about 14 million people in the United States. What our focus is we're not trying to compete with colonoscopy. We want to raise the awareness of the importance of screening early detection, because when you do detect cancers early, there's good outcomes. 9 out of 10 people have good outcomes, versus when you detect it late, 1 out of 10. And we're proud of our commercial organization. We have people that are out there every single day talking to physicians, talking to health systems, talking to payers, talking to advocacy groups about the importance of early detection, getting out there and getting screened. The sense of urgency is this, especially around colorectal cancer. There's 60 million people right now above the age of 45 that are of average risk that are right now not caught up with their screening for colorectal cancer. It is the most preventable cancer, but yet it's the least prevented. And that's what our mission is. Our mission is to making sure every day that we get that message out, that there are options out there for getting screened. So if you're 45 years old or older of average risk and you're not screened, go out and get screened.
Awesome. A good segue to talking about the standards and basic principles of early detection for population health. A lot of people know that it's important to get tested. I think everyone here it's a good reminder. But why do people not get screened? I think, how do we kind of think about this? Peter, do you want to start by sharing?
Sure. It's my guess is, that people here know about the preventive measures they're supposed to have, and I would bet 1 out of 3 people are behind on a regular primary care visit. They're not necessarily doing the things that they know they should do. They have a Post-it sitting there somewhere saying, I should have gone to the dentist, I should go, whatever. And people are busy. And one of the challenges is simply logistics. So in the case of a colonoscopy, which is the gold standard, or the follow-up test after Exact's Cologuard, for example, in the case of the CT scan for lung cancer, which is what happens if our blood test comes back positive, we call it elevated, that's the result. That's an endeavor, right? A colonoscopy takes an overnight prep and you're out for at least half a day from work. Same thing with a CAT scan. Even though the CAT scan itself takes 20 seconds, you have to get to the facility and other things like that. And it means taking away time from other priorities. And so those things always get pushed to the side. And then in each case, the patient experience has certain burden. The CAT scan has false positives that require follow-up. Colonoscopies require that prep. It's a very safe procedure, of course. But those are other reasons to they get put off. And then at least in the case of, lung cancer, the disease we're focused on, although we're developing more tests, patients who've smoked for a while, who are older, and the criteria are 50 or older and smoke for 20 pack years, meaning about a pack a day for 20 years or more, they can have other medical problems that are more pressing. And so, for all the time I was in practice, it was pretty rare for somebody to come in and and for me to ask, how are you doing? And the answer be awesome, right? There's always something more pressing to deal with. And so it's one of the reasons we hope that something as simple as a blood test, a single tube of blood that can just be added to the order with anything else that's happening, like a cholesterol check or something, will be a way of lowering that initial barrier for evaluation to get what's about 14 million people right now who should be screened annually who aren't being screened for lung cancer.
Everett, you have a very established, program that is reimbursed by, and it's also kind of standard of care. But how do you think about, as a commercial team, increasing that rate? And also on the Preventive side, there's a lot of hype with Kim Kardashian and a lot of PR, and it's kind of cool to get a Preventive screening. It's a little bit different from I don't know, I mean, maybe it's cool to get a Cologuard screening as well, but we'd love to talk a little bit about kind of getting people to get excited about taking these tests.
I mean, I think a Cologuard screen is pretty cool.
Just kidding.
It's also like I've never seen somebody put reimbursement and Kim Kardashian in the same
I know, that's
that's
well,
like amazing.
well done. Yeah.
Can I just maybe pick on one point that I think is really important? I mean, this is what I've noticed is, so we do this very transformative scan that's quite comprehensive for a lot of things, not just cancer. And it's very common when I'll tell people what we do that folks will say, oh, I'm not sure I want to know. And I start to think about this, and I think actually there's a much bigger systemic problem that collectively we sort of need to change hearts and minds around, which is we have a healthcare system that is reactive, that is all about sick care. And by definition, even the word disease is scary in this system because it's more often caught late. It's more often life-changing. It costs a lot of money. You might have to quit your job to get over whatever cancer or whatever it might be. And I think the promise of early detection in some ways is to redefine what disease means, from something that's scary to something that's about maintaining our bodies, about, easy fixes, inexpensive, much more likely to be successful. And I actually think that's one of the biggest impediments for people taking up screening that we know that we should be doing.
I agree with that, actually. And I think I've started calling it a cancer pandemic because there is this weird lack of a sense of urgency. We have 600,000 people in the United States, 10 million people globally that are going to die every year from cancer. 70% of those cancer deaths are in cancer types that don't have a recommended screen. So we're thinking very deeply about how do we extend the benefits of those single cancer screens to as many cancer types as possible. And so analogous to the Prenovo whole body, we have a blood-based test that can detect a shared cancer signal from more than 50 different cancer types. More than 45 of those don't have a recommended screening test at all. And if we detect a cancer signal, we then predict where in the body that cancer signal is coming from, which is very purposeful so that we're directing that downstream diagnostic workup and making it efficient for both the healthcare provider and the patient to get to a diagnosis efficiently. And I really strongly agree that there is power in information. And I think a lot of the head in the sand I don't want to know is because there haven't been modalities for early detection for a lot of really scary cancers like pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, liver cancer, all things that our test detects really well. And I know other technologies can detect well as well.
I'll maybe approach it from a little different standpoint, and that is when we talk about cancer, we talk about prevalence. There's healthcare disparity within cancer. And if I just double click on colorectal cancer, it's higher prevalence in Alaska Natives, higher prevalence in Native Americans, higher prevalence in Black Americans. Black Americans are 20% more likely to have colorectal cancer. Yeah. And when they have colorectal cancer, they're 40% more likely to die from it. And I think a lot of that is from access, lack of access. I think a lot of it is cultural. I'm speaking from my own vantage point that, in my household, screening, well care, it wasn't that everyday conversation in my family and a lot of Black families in the United States. And so I'm proud of the work that Exact Sciences is doing. We've dedicated a team that their sole remit is to focus on disparities of care, healthcare equity, how do we partner better with advocacy groups that are out there, federally qualified health centers. We have a long ways to go to close the care gaps, especially in screening for cancers.
It's amazing. Jumping to our next question, just thinking about how do we improve the gaps in care and how do you get to providers? Does anyone want to talk a little bit about, how do you kind of get your tests in front of providers so that they can recommend in their communities?
Well, I think one thing that we all sort of have in common is that these are relatively easy tests to do. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the access issues is, if you're a single mother with 2 kids and no stable childcare and you are symptomatic, there was a study in the UK in 2003 that showed it can take up to 6 months to go from first symptom to diagnosis, and that involves tons of check-ins with doctors and tests and so on. And if you can't get away from the house to do all these tests, you're going to get diagnosed later, and we know that outcomes are likely to be much worse. So here we have a set of companies that have, very easy tests to do, 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 and can shortcut some of that backwards and forwards that has a disproportionate effect on people that maybe don't have the time to follow up as quickly as others.
Yeah. And
I think about the partnerships now. It's industry can't do it alone, physicians can't do it alone, advocacy can't do it alone, patients can't do it alone. So at Exact Sciences, we're really focused on what productive partnerships can we have with health systems, with payers, with government, in getting these easy to take, accessible tests out to as many people as possible. So we don't just rely on a point of care visit with doctors, but now we're relying on payers, health systems to allow us to do bulk ordering of our tests to get it in the hands of these people that need it. And some of these people are these tough to screen patients that will never go to a physician's office, but they will have different opportunities to get access to our tests. And we're doing more of those partnerships in the last year than we've ever done.
That's
Awesome.
fantastic.
Yeah,
And I think the partnership issue, sorry, Peter, the partnership issue is really critical. And I think analogous to Exact, we have deep partnerships across healthcare, big healthcare systems, smaller private practice, as well as with some progressive employer partners who are represented here, and some progressive payer groups as well, which is really exciting. I think access is really, really critical. And one of the really cool partnerships, actually two of them that I'll highlight, is we have a partnership with the VA and we have a partnership with Ochsner in Louisiana, specifically to get these tests into the underserved communities where access and engaging with the healthcare system in general is challenging for a lot of reasons, not just cost, which I know we'll come to in a minute. We're also, when we talk about access, actually I'll talk about it now. When we talk about access, reimbursement is the big, elephant in the room, I think, for all of us here. And so we've taken a path very purposefully towards, we've launched as a lab developed test because we felt a deep sense of responsibility based on the really robust clinical validation that we have that translated to an intended use population that we just published in the Lancet last week, so go look that paper up. It's the Pathfinder study. And concurrently, while we're implementing, setting up our clinical care services to support patients through their journey, making sure that we have access paths and learning from all of these implementation experiences, we're working very closely with the FDA and have started a modular submission process so that we can get FDA approval and hopefully grease the proverbial wheels towards reimbursement upon approval. So.
Yeah, so again, if the domain of how you get screening tests done at scale, and all the relationships are very important, but it's a little arcane, but it's effective. In other cancer screenings we have, and Everett's rightly highlighted the deficiencies we have, but it's kind of worked also, like cervical cancer screening rates are high, vaccination rates, another kind of public health denominator kind of approach, quite high for most vaccines, despite a little stuff that's going on right now that's a little disturbing on that front. But the basic idea is you produce evidence that you're going to prevent deaths from the cancer, right? So in the case of colorectal cancer screening, evidence is extraordinarily strong, several decades of randomized trials. Case of lung cancer, we've got about a decade of high-quality randomized controlled trials showing that if you screen this population, you'll prevent deaths, in the case of lung, by like 20 to 25%. Then you develop tests that have high sensitivity for the disease so that if you use it, like our blood test or Cologuard or one of Cologuard's competitors, FIT or something like that, which is a slightly different biomarker test, that they find the early cancers so that then you can go to guideline organizations and ultimately the United States Preventive Services Task Force, this body that evaluates the evidence and says, okay, if you use this test, and Cologuard's test is in there, then you will have this cascade of good things happen at population level. You'll prevent deaths from colorectal cancer. We see all the evidence there. And they also worry about, well, if you run your test, like what bad things could happen? So in the case of Cologuard, I hope it's okay I talk about it.
No, please. Yeah, you're doing it.
Without being too graphic, it's like poop on a stick, right? Like the risk is pretty low, right? In the case of our test, it's a blood draw. Not zero risk, but it's a venous blood draw, one tube of blood, pretty straightforward. But the other question is, what happens when the results come back? And in colon cancer screening and lung cancer screening, the term of art is reflex test. What do you do when a positive comes back? One of the big sources of harm is that doctors don't know what to do. And Megan just made mention of this, that their test comes back and it kind of tells the doctor, well, this isn't some wild goose chase, this is where you should look. Same with lung, the reflex test is this low-dose CT, colonoscopy in the case of colorectal cancer. And then the last thing they worry about is, what if patients misunderstand a negative result? What if they see this result and say, oh, I'm good? So again, the way we measure this is something called negative predictive value. Arcane term, but when the test says, no, you don't have cancer, what's actually the likelihood you don't have cancer?
Right.
That number has to be extraordinarily high, because otherwise you could have people misunderstanding your test. So in the case, again, of Cologuard, of our test is specific to lung cancer. Negative predictive value is 99.7%, means 3 in 1,000 people will be wrong on with a negative result. But they know it's only about lung cancer. So they're very unlikely, we're gonna go figure this out, but they're very unlikely to say, oh, I don't need a mammogram, right? Or I don't need colon cancer screening or something like that, because they know they were just tested for lung cancer. This gets more complicated as you broaden the aperture and you're testing for more cancers. The potential for that sort of harm, which most of us in real life don't think about, but that's what the USPSTF thinks about. And that's what you need, that's the body you need to convince to get coverage and reimbursement. And then it's automatic, it's by law.
And I would, sorry if you don't mind.
Okay.
I actually would chime in and absolutely agree that when you broaden, it does get a little bit more complicated, and that's why these tests are designed to complement, not replace. And we've also done really a nice body of work showing that patients are no less likely to adhere to their regular screening when they do a multi-cancer test with a negative result, right? That follow-up is really important, and of course that risk benefit will be important to the USPSTF. I also want to push on the sensitivity issue really quickly, and I think for single cancer tests, optimizing sensitivity makes perfect sense. Of course you want to maximize sensitivity. The problem with sensitivity as a measure for a truly multi-cancer test is that an aggregate sensitivity is entirely impacted by the cancer type and stage distribution that you have in your population. More indolent cancers don't shed DNA as well. They are inherently less detectable by any cell-free DNA-based technology. More aggressive cancers shed a lot more DNA, are much more detectable by technology. So an aggregate sensitivity as a multi-cancer tool, not just for us, for anybody in the multi-cancer space, is really going to be relatively meaningless. So for single cancer, yes, sensitivity is your measure. For multi-cancer, I would argue that positive predictive value is your more important measure. And this is something that Steve Hahn mentioned yesterday in the early detection panel. I don't know if everybody heard that great conversation, which is important not just for a safety issue, but also for a performance issue. And the positive predictive value of multi-cancer tests, at least I can speak for ours, is 10 times higher than that of most of the single cancer tests. So there's a real sense of urgency there, and it's less impacted by the kinds of cancers that you have in the population, so it's much easier to interpret. So
let me just define the term. This is all really confusing stuff. Sensitivity is if you have the disease, the test is positive. Positive predictive value is if you have a positive test
result,
that you have the disease. So
That's
those
right.
things, if you say those things 3 times quickly, I think you turn into a pumpkin. But they are actually really different measures. And by the way, I wasn't espousing a particular position. I was simply reciting what the USPSTF states as a standard, which is if you have the cancer, you find it, which is a measure called sensitivity.
I think the key takeaway is we should all package these tests and sell it together. I wanted to ask Andrew if you had any thoughts about sort of your body scans are very broad compared to screening just one lung cancer, and then the idea of false positives, there's some kind of risk in that sense as well, and there's a little bit of controversy, so I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Well, I guess our approach is a little bit orthogonal because, we take a radiometric approach to investigating lesions and figuring out whether they're, on the one hand, benign and nothing you need to worry about, or something that's concerning and you should do follow-up testing. And radiometrically, solid tumors, actually, kind of regardless of organ of origin, have more things in common than they have different amongst themselves. And so in some ways, we are a broad test for cancer, but the signal we're looking for is pretty identical regardless of the organ. So it's a little different, so I don't know quite how to compare it to liquid biopsy. And then secondly, the approach we take is quite different as well. We essentially kind of do primary care radiology in a screening context. And so we are in the business of really risk stratifying lesions that we see. And so false positive is even kind of a strange word for us because we take these very well-studied multi-parametric MRI techniques that are proven to be effective in individual organs, and we apply them in the entire body. And they're very, very good at separating lesions you should not worry about at all, that we all have, by the way, and things that are concerning that require some additional investigation. And our challenge as a company really is, how can we keep improving the test so the category in the middle, if we think about, for the doctors like the pyrads or birads, that category 3, the indeterminate finding, how do we make that category as small as possible? And one of the benefits we have as a routine screening exam is that oftentimes those indeterminate findings are small and therefore hard to characterize. And what's great is we can just look at them again next time the patient comes in, and either they've resolved or unchanged, in which case it's fine, or they've grown and developed malignant characteristics, but still early enough that the cancer is still stage 1.
Looking at the audience questions, and there's a question about how do you manage the cascade costs potentially caused by false positive generated by screening, and all these tests not all the tests are fully reimbursed yet, because it takes so many years of proof. So how do you guys think about sort of cost in the system?
Yeah, I mean, it's important. Our strategy at Exact Sciences is making sure that our tests are reimbursed. Our on-market tests right now, we're lucky that we have really good reimbursement. Even if you do have a positive Cologuard and you have to go to a colonoscopy, it's reimbursed. And so we're happy about that. Now, we have work to do, though, because we have future tests that are coming that we have to lose our individual company jerseys, and we have to go collectively to the Hill and talk to the right people in Washington, D.C. to get these tests reimbursed. And my role is to create a value proposition for this. And I always say to people that cancer right now for people under the age of 85 is the #1 killer. There was 600,000 cancer deaths last year. 70% of cancers right now don't have effective screening. That's the sense of urgency. That's what the cancer moonshot is all about. And regardless of the company that you're coming from and the innovation that we have in the space, we got to collectively go and march to the Hill and talk about the importance of this. And reimbursement is critically important.
If the FDA was here, what would you say to them? How would we lobby?
Ooh.
We need reimbursement. We need innovation to save lives, to eradicate cancer.
Yeah.
And we can't do it alone. It's not just about industry, but it's about the people that are behind the innovation, that are working at the best health systems and academic centers in the world. And we all need to pull together, because having it kill this many people, we can prevent that.
And I think
Go
there's
ahead.
sorry.
Please, Megan.
I know the FDA is thinking about this deeply, the speed of innovation. I think this ties into kind of how do we balance innovation and regulation, right? And I think, so first to Everett's point, we absolutely need the rising tide to raise all boats. So we do need to, band together as kind of cancer screening in general, multi-cancer screening, and make sure that they hear the voices and the importance of expanding access, which is going to include FDA approval, reimbursement. There are frameworks, I think, and I don't want to speak for the FDA because I'm not part of the FDA, but I know there are frameworks getting put in place that would enable faster change control through the regulatory process for machine learning-based approaches. Like our test has, as I'm sure a lot of them do here, a really deep machine learning algorithm that's foundational to the product. And so when you're constantly learning and iterating on a product, how do you make sure that you can get it through the regulatory path that traditionally has been focused on pharma and tends to be a little bit slower than I think the innovation that's happening in the space. So I know they're thinking deeply about that and have put out some guidance and change control and machine learning-based algorithms. So I'm excited about that.
Awesome.
I guess I have more questions than answers, in the sense that, all of the 4 or 5 screening exams that are covered, Pap smear, clinically proven in 1910, not covered until the 50s or 60s. Mammogram, clinically proven in the 60s, not covered until the 90s. PSA, 70s, not covered until the 90s. Colonoscopy took decades as well. So there's something about the way that we're investigating these tests as well, where if the end goal of any investigative test is like a reduction in all causes mortality, you're automatically signing up for like a 20, 30, 40-year clinical trial costing billions of dollars that requires a moonshot level of investment behind it to even answer those questions. So I don't have an answer, but I wonder whether there's a different way of looking at these tests, because we have a health system that is very good at evaluating incremental change and finding like a local maxima, but is sort of struggles to find transformational change that finds sort of the peak behind that.
And
well, hold on. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I've interrupted you.
Yeah, well, like time horizons and statistical design stuff is a fascination for me. So the National Lung Screening Trial, the lung cancer screening trial, demonstrated an all-cause mortality reduction of 6.7% in 6.5 years with 25,000 subjects in each arm. And so it's a mythology that's been built around that's been constructed as, I think, as a line of defense against generating high-quality evidence. But it's not true. It's not true based on what's already been done, right? Sigmoidoscopy lowers all-cause mortality. Colorectal cancer, like we have piles of studies, and of relatively short duration. And so I'm optimistic.
Just to be clear, lung cancer screening is not covered for people of normal risk. And when you start getting into normal risk, the power required for those studies goes up tremendously.
But sigmoidoscopy lowered all-cause mortality. I think the entry age in that was like 50 or something like that. So, yeah, look, if you want to screen people who have a very low probability of having disease, of course, it's inefficient, which means your trial has to be bigger. But that inefficiency is dictated by the prevalence of the disease and the group you're trying to target, not something fundamentally challenging about doing proper clinical studies. But I actually thought the question was about the FDA, and I just wanted to say that, it's always good sport to beat on regulators. Like, it's all fun for us. But, we have breakthrough designation. I think you guys do too,
we do,
right?
Yeah.
And, we've had multiple interactions with the agency. And they, of course, like, would we rather, just be given a B on our test automatically and not have to study for it? Sure. But, they're asking the right questions. They're saying, like, well, can you rely on your test result? Does it have high sensitivity? Does it find lung cancer? Can we trust that we can map the cancers you find to the National Lung Screening Trial, to the European trial called Nelson? Do we know you're finding the same disease? And they're asking those sorts of questions. And I actually think, it's one of those things, like, of course, we'd like to be on the market sooner. We'd like to have reimbursement sooner. Like, that makes our returns better. But, like, once we adopt these, Andrew's right. It took too long, right, in many of these cases. Way too long for things like colonoscopy that we as doctors were like sneaking into the system by miscoding and stuff before it was covered well. But once it's in there, we're stuck with it. And so doing a little bit of homework up front, and working with regulators to get that level of evidence is really important. Megan's, of course, right. The ability to iterate when you can quickly is going to be important. But I think it's particularly in population health interventions, like, all of us are saying, hey, you feel pretty good today? Let's go see if you have cancer, right? Like, we're doing something to somebody who otherwise is just going along their merry way. The bar for evidence is really, really high, and it should be.
So Andrew, are you going to go to the regulators to get reimbursed, or how do you think about Pronovo's goal to their direct consumer route?
Our strategy really has two pieces to it, and they're symbiotic. The first is just work very hard to bring the cost of the scan down. Mm-hmm. And we do that through scaling out the testing facilities that we have, through reducing the time it takes to acquire images in these very expensive MRI machines, and through increasingly investigating ways for using AI to make radiology more effective and efficient, because that's the single biggest cost in our business. The second, obviously, is to work to collect evidence of efficacy over a large scale. We're kicking off a big clinical trial actually next month in one site that we're going to roll out to all of our sites and build that evidence base to then have those conversations with regulators and insurance companies to work to make this ideally over time standard of care for everyone.
Yeah,
Right.
and I agree that levels of evidence are really critical. Totally agree with Peter and Andrew, the levels, and Everett, I'm sure. That the levels of evidence are critical, and I think the randomized controlled trials are absolutely the gold standard. So we actually have a fully enrolled 140,000 person randomized controlled trial in a really unique partnership with the UK National Health Service called NHS Gallery that is really tied towards what I like to call an intermediate endpoint of a reduction in late stage mortality that may be a nice balance between we need to get to a mortality endpoint, I might push on all-cause mortality as an appropriate endpoint, but that's a separate discussion. Maybe a nice balance between let's work towards that as an endpoint and how can we get the technologies that are rigorously supported by robust clinical evidence to market and reimbursed and approved faster. So that's something that is a really deep discussion in the field, is what are the intermediate endpoints that we might start thinking about collectively, not just with our single company capes on.
I tell you what, we're having the right discussion around innovation and cancer care and the effectiveness of tests. What keeps me up at night are, as we innovate, as we introduce AI, as we introduce just different tests to eradicate cancer, it cannot be for those who can only afford it. Because I go back to my earlier statement of disparities of care. And if we as companies, as academia, create those tests of people that can only afford it, it actually widens the healthcare disparity gap. And we have to think differently around that. And again, we can't do it alone. It has to be everybody involved. So.
Yeah, actually one of the questions, we're summarizing 2 questions on diversity and disparities. There's so many disparities, like you mentioned, with Black patients with lung cancer, breast cancer. How are you thinking about equity with all of your tests? And then another question was related to how can digital health help empower patients to demand the most up-to-date care? Like, how do we empower patients to ask for these tests on site?
Now, I'll start from how I think about closing disparities, and that is, first of all, having a test that's easy and effective. You have to. It cannot be complex. It has to be to where the user experience is easy to understand. That's number one. Number two, and like I said, at Exact, we developed a team that this is what they do. This is their day job. We have to go into those communities. We have to go into communities that people really don't think about traditionally. We have to go into churches, and we have to go into barbershops. We have to go in and understand how they think about healthcare and then guide our strategies towards that. And I just like the way that we're thinking about partnering with, other entities, like I said, FQHCs, and doing that and going where those patients are to, again, decrease the care gap.
I mean, I think I'm going to apply for a job at Exact, by the way, listening to you. Equity is the easiest word to say and the hardest word to effectuate. And of course, cost is really important. Like, if you want to scale, it just can't be something that is unaffordable for payers, which is ultimately funded by taxpayers and everybody else. But, and you have 2 users, right? You have the patient and their experience, so it can't be burdensome to the patient. But you also have whatever doctor has to deal with the result of that test. And, as a doctor who has dealt with the results of many, many tests, probably not that well in some cases, it needs to be really clear what to do next. This word I used earlier, reflex. What do you reflex? If it comes back positive, Cologuard comes back positive, I know what to do as a doc. Like, I say, okay, let's get you scheduled for a colonoscopy. Straightforward. That's actually, if you think about how our healthcare system is distributed. And look, it's easy to sit here and have canapes and imagine that our system is constructed that the next new Ferrari we introduce into healthcare is going to solve all of our problems because our healthcare system is paved like the Autobahn. But that is a complete delusion compared to the reality of what patients face. It's like dirt roads, a GPS that doesn't work. And so everything has to be for busy docs and patients with other demands. Has to be, do this, and then here's the thing, supported by evidence, it's been studied by independent doctors, do this next thing. And otherwise, you're going to face struggles as you get to populations that live paycheck to paycheck, have 2 jobs, are dealing with a lot of other things. You introduce more complexity in people's lives, you've done them a harm, even if your test finds cancer. So that's, I think, and lung cancer, prostate cancer, and colorectal cancer, those 2 account for 70% of all disparities between whites and blacks with cancer. So if you care about disparities, that's where you go. And then you have to figure out what to do next and make that easy too.
I think one really practical sort of learning for me in the last 4 years of running Preventive was, we produce this very detailed radiology test. And we initially thought, we got feedback that doctors didn't want to be told what to do, so we didn't provide recommendations. And then we did follow-up of our first 1,000-person clinical trial, and we had found these very clinically relevant findings that doctors weren't following up with their patients because they didn't know what to do. And so we found like...
So we're adolescents.
No, I mean,
have to deal with us.
I understand there's a big variance of physician quality out there, and the radiologist is the physician's physician to some extent. So we changed completely our process so that we provide very precise recommendations on what we think the patient should do together with their physician. And in some ways, like, empower the patient to at least overcome that one piece of disparity so that they can advocate for their own healthcare.
Yeah, same. And I know we're at time, but same. We've been thinking very deeply about that continuity of care and making sure that patients and physicians are supported in their decision making and follow-up. And Annabella made the great point in one of the panels yesterday from the Cancer Moonshot that it's not just coverage of these technologies that's important, it's coverage of the follow-up tests. And I know Exact has been really trailblazing in that aspect, so thank you for paving the way there. That's going to be critical to make sure that there's continuity of care for all patients.
Awesome.
With any of these technologies.
Well, I know we have a lot more questions from the audience, so maybe you can ask them on your own. But thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for having a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.